What if I told you that, in medieval Europe, animals could be arrested, tried, and even executed for crimes? Not metaphorically, literally. Pigs hanged for murder, horses excommunicated, and wolves, feral, elusive predators dragged into courtrooms and sentenced like humans. In one chilling 15th century case, a wolf that mauled a child was captured, brought before a judge, and put on trial. Witnesses testified. A defense was mounted. The verdict, death. This isn't the plot of a dark fairy tale, it's documented legal history. But why? Why would people treat beasts like citizens of the court? Was it superstition, control, or something deeper? A fear that the line between man and animal was thinner than we dare to admit? Welcome to a world where justice had no species limit, and even a howl in the night could end in a noose. Imagine walking into a 15th century courtroom. The air is thick with the smell of damp stone and candle wax. Nobles in wool cloaks sit on one side, clergy on the other. A judge, robed in red, slams a gavel and declares, "The accused shall now stand trial." But the accused is not a man. It's a wolf. This isn't fiction. Across Europe in the Middle Ages, real courts tried real animals. Wolves, pigs, horses, even insects. They were charged with crimes ranging from murder to theft, and they were often given the same formal proceedings as humans. Witnesses were called, legal representation was assigned. Sometimes the animals were even executed. Why did this happen? Were medieval people simply ignorant, unable to separate animal instinct from human intent? Or was something more symbolic, more ritualistic, at play? The answers lie buried in strange legal records, forgotten scrolls and ancient superstitions that reveal a society terrified by nature and desperately trying to impose order on chaos. Our journey begins in France in the year 1457. In the small town of Savigny, a pig stood trial for murdering a child. The evidence was damning. Eyewitnesses saw the swine mauling the young boy. The pig was assigned a defense lawyer, and after a formal proceeding, it was sentenced to death by hanging. And so it was done. While that may sound absurd today, medieval logic held that if humans were tried for breaking divine or civil law, so too should animals, especially when their actions threatened the fabric of the moral world. Wolves, in particular, were viewed not just as beasts but as agents of evil. In Christian thought, they often symbolized the devil himself, prowling through villages and devouring the innocent. There are accounts of wolves being excommunicated by bishops, chased into forests by holy processions, and even tried en masse as a collective entity. In 1379, a group of wolves was summoned to court in Saint-Julien in France, accused of raiding church lands. They were convicted in absentia and cursed by a priest. To our modern minds, this all feels like the blending of courtroom drama and dark fairy tale. But for those who lived in medieval Europe, where life was short, disease was rampant, and predators lurked beyond the light of village fires, justice had to extend beyond the human realm. In their eyes, holding animals accountable was not only possible, but essential to maintain cosmic order. This concept of animal culpability wasn't unique to France. Across Italy, Switzerland, and Germany, similar cases appeared in court records. Insects that ravaged crops were tried by church officials and even offered legal representation. If they didn't vacate within a specified time, they were excommunicated. Such proceedings reveal a peculiar blending of law, theology, and folklore. The courtroom was more than a place of justice. It was a theatre of morality, a sacred stage where even the irrational could be tamed through ritual. So, how did this all begin? How did rational legal systems, many of which form the basis of modern European law, come to include the prosecution of beasts? And what does this tell us about the deep fears that haunted the medieval imagination? In the chapters ahead, we'll uncover forgotten transcripts, explore symbolic punishments, and meet the strange lawyers who defended beasts. But first, we must understand how the legal world saw animals, not as mere creatures, but as beings capable of sin, guilt, and punishment. Let us descend into the archives of madness where pigs are. Let us turn now to one of the most infamous cases in the history of animal trials, a grim and curious event that took place in the Norman town of Falaise, France in the year 1386. A pig, accused of killing and partially eating a 3-month-old baby, was arrested, detained, and eventually tried in a formal court of law. What followed wasn't merely an execution, it was a full judicial ceremony, complete with legal counsel, official sentencing, and a public hanging. The pig's trial was no joke. It was dressed in a waistcoat and breeches to resemble a human criminal. Eyewitnesses were summoned, testimony was given, and when the judge passed sentence, the pig was publicly hanged in the town square for all to see. The purpose was not punishment alone, it was a symbolic act meant to affirm divine and social order. What's more disturbing, the fact that this was considered justice or the fact that the crowd cheered, this trial wasn't unique. Over a span of 300 years, dozens of pigs were executed for killing children or mauling adults. In medieval eyes, pigs were especially dangerous. Allowed to roam freely through villages, they had powerful jaws, sharp tusks, and a taste for refuse, including sometimes human remains. But it wasn't just about animal danger, it was about moral theatre. The trial served as a message: justice must be upheld, even when the criminal defies nature. By holding animals accountable, the court symbolically fought back against chaos and terror. When justice extended beyond humans, it reflected a society desperate for control in a world filled with disease, famine, and uncertainty. Records show that in some cases, animal trials lasted weeks. A pig could be held in a prison, cared for by jailers, and even exonerated if the court deemed its behavior justified. If it had been provoked, for example, it might be spared. This was not mindless execution. It was an attempt to force nature to conform to human law, to place animals within the moral universe. The Church often oversaw these trials, believing sin had stained not just mankind, but all of creation. This perspective stemmed from theological roots, specifically the doctrine that animals, while soulless, could be influenced by Satan and serve as vessels of evil. Thus, a pig that attacked a child might not be merely acting on instinct, it might be possessed. The Falaise pig became a notorious example recorded in multiple chronicles and even cited in legal studies centuries later. It's often used today to mock the so-called backwardness of the Middle Ages, but that view is simplistic. In truth, these animal trials reflect a consistent worldview, a belief that divine law had to be enforced at all levels, and that even beasts could not escape its reach. But there's another layer to this. These public punishments served as spectacles, morbid entertainment for the masses, yes, but also social rituals reinforcing communal values. When the pig swung from the gallows, it wasn't just the end of a trial, it was a statement. We are not helpless in the face of darkness. Today, we see the trial of the Falaise pig as a surreal chapter in legal history. Yet, in its time, it was serious, sacred, and symbolic. It tells us more about the people of the Middle Ages than any textbook ever could. So what other animals were tried in such ways? And who defended them in court? To understand the full strangeness of this legal phenomenon, we must next meet the lawyers, men who took these cases with genuine professionalism, even when their clients were pigs, bulls, or beetles. It might sound unbelievable, but in some of these medieval animal trials, the accused weren't simply executed on the spot. They were defended by professional lawyers. Yes, actual barristers, trained in canon and civil law, were appointed to argue on behalf of the pig, the dog, or even the grasshopper. These weren't mock proceedings. They were serious, formal, and occasionally successful. The courtrooms of medieval Europe had room for all creatures, and the defense counsel had a duty to preserve justice, even if justice was tangled in fur or feathers. The defense might argue that the pig had been provoked, that the dog had acted in self-defense, or that the evidence was circumstantial. They could point to procedural irregularities, demand character witnesses, or invoke divine will. In 15th century Savigny, France, a pig accused of infanticide was spared execution because the court ruled that its owner had been negligent in restraining it. The pig had a defense lawyer and he won, not because of sympathy, but because the law was applied with meticulous detail. In some trials, entire pig families were acquitted, while a single guilty piglet was sentenced to death. One of the most famous of these animal advocates was Bartholomew Chassenet, a brilliant French jurist who made his reputation in the 16th century by defending rats. When a plague of rats was summoned to court for destroying grain stores in autumn, Chassenet argued that the summons had not been properly delivered to all rats, and therefore the case should be dismissed. He even claimed that the rats failed to appear in court out of fear for their safety, as the roads were patrolled by hostile cats. This wasn't satire, it was legal theatre. And it worked. The trial was eventually dropped. The purpose of these defences wasn't just to delay execution, it was to maintain legal consistency, even when the subject defied belief. To the medieval mind, the law was not merely for people, it was an instrument of divine order. If a pig could be tried, then it must be granted defence. If a rat could be excommunicated, then it must first be summoned. These legal procedures echoed a deeper fear that the world was teetering on the edge of chaos. Famine, disease, war, and unexplained misfortune struck regularly. When crops failed or children died mysteriously, animals were sometimes blamed, not just as scapegoats, but as agents of supernatural disorder. And so, the court stepped in. Even insects had their day in court. In Switzerland, a group of beetles that destroyed a vineyard were put on trial. Their lawyer argued that the beetles were acting according to the natural order, created by God, and could not be punished for fulfilling their divine role. The judge, torn between reason and religion, ordered that a separate field be set aside for the beetles, a compromise between extermination and absolution. Modern viewers might laugh. But for medieval people, the court was not about guilt or innocence in the modern sense, it was about restoring balance. A pig that killed was not merely dangerous, it represented a tear in the moral fabric. And so, it had to be judged, not just killed, but weighed, measured, and legally condemned. As for the lawyers, they weren't just performers, they were believers. They understood that the animal trials were symbolic rituals, deeply rooted in religious and legal tradition. Their arguments might sound absurd now, but they were crafted with the same precision and passion as any human trial. In this strange mirror of justice, animals were not merely beasts. They became citizens of a world ruled by divine and human law. And sometimes, just sometimes, they walked free. So, what about the other side? Who brought charges against animals? Who prosecuted them in the name of law and God? And what role did the church play in all of this? Let's follow the path from courtrooms to cathedrals and examine the ecclesiastical trials where animals faced not just judgment, but damnation. While secular courts dealt with pigs, dogs, and wolves that harmed humans, the church took aim at a different class of offenders: insects, frogs, snakes, and even locusts. These weren't criminal trials, they were ecclesiastical. And the charges? Violations against God's natural order. These creatures were said to disrupt the divine balance, destroying crops, spreading disease, or acting as agents of the devil himself. In medieval Europe, a swarm of insects could be more than an agricultural disaster. It could be a spiritual crisis. When an infestation struck, communities didn't just turn to farmers or town councils, they turned to the clergy. Entire congregations gathered to issue formal summonses to pests. The creatures were warned. If they failed to leave the premises after being served notice, delivered through the ringing of church bells or read aloud in the fields, they could be excommunicated. Yes, excommunication, reserved for heretics and the damned, was wielded against the smallest of God's creatures. In one case, in 1519, the people of Lausanne, Switzerland, brought legal action against a group of fieldworms. A priest was appointed to serve as their judge. After reading aloud their crimes and providing ample warning, the fieldworms were excommunicated in a formal ceremony. And these rituals weren't just symbolic. The church took them seriously, with full ceremonial robes, candles, and even incense. Processions were held in towns, with priests carrying relics and chanting prayers, not for rain or mercy, but for the expulsion of criminal caterpillars. The logic behind it was spiritual warfare. If insects were plaguing the land, perhaps the people had sinned. Perhaps they had invoked divine wrath. By bringing the matter to ecclesiastical court, communities hoped not only to remove the pests but also to cleanse their souls. The legal proceedings were a form of penance. One particularly eerie case occurred in the Diocese of Autun, France, in the 16th century. a horde of weevils was accused of destroying vineyards, threatening the local wine economy. The court demanded the insects leave within 6 days. When they didn't, they were solemnly excommunicated. But before issuing the sentence, the court actually debated whether the weevils were also entitled to a safe alternative habitat. Incredibly, the court proposed setting aside a plot of land for them, a kind of divine compromise. This surreal mix of theology, law, and superstition reveals just how porous the boundaries were between religion and the natural world. The medieval mindset didn't separate the earthly from the spiritual. A plague of flies wasn't just annoying, it could mean that hell was leaking into earth. Church documents even reference demons riding animals or possessing them. In 1324, in Ireland, a priest claimed that a demonic presence had possessed a local cow, which was acting aggressively and foaming at the mouth. The cow was subjected to prayers of exorcism. When it calmed down, it was declared cleansed, and the priest hailed as a holy man. In some parts of Europe, these trials evolved into long-standing rituals. In Italian villages, snakes were once paraded through town on St. Days, not in worship, but as a warning, to keep the wild in check. In parts of Germany, it was common to see monks throwing holy water on swarms of bees or ants before pronouncing curses over them. And while it's easy to dismiss these acts as superstition, they fulfilled a vital role in pre-modern society. When science could not yet explain the cause of plagues or weather anomalies, people needed ritual. They needed a process, something that made sense of chaos. In these trials, they found it. The church became both judge and intercessor, not just for humans, but for the very world they inhabited. The idea that everything had a place in God's order meant that when something went wrong, it had to be corrected, with legal precision and spiritual intent. But what happened when the animals fought back? When wolves became more than symbols of sin and started targeting humans in waves of brutal attacks, a darker chapter of animal trials emerged, one rooted in fear, violence, and vengeance. Let's descend now into the forests of France, where wolves were not just wild, but possibly possessed. France. The year is 1520. Deep in the rural province of Gévaudan, villagers live in fear, not of armies or bandits, but of something wilder, something with glowing eyes and teeth that tear through flesh. Wolves. In this era, wolves weren't just animals, they were nightmares wrapped in fur. Reports spread of a wolf that had killed over a dozen children, dragging them from paths, from fields, even from the edge of town. Locals believed this was no ordinary beast. It was a werewolf, or worse, an agent of the devil. When hunters finally brought down the massive animal, it was paraded through the village. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a trial. That's right, a trial. The body of the wolf was brought before a magistrate, placed on display, and its crimes were read aloud. Witnesses, grieving parents, terrified shepherds testified. Their voices cracked with horror. The wolf, of course, remained silent, but its silence was interpreted as insolence. According to the court record, the wolf had committed murder, terror, and heresy, a fascinating charge. By attacking humans, the beast was seen not just as a threat to life, but as a challenger to divine order. The court pronounced judgment guilty. The wolf's corpse was hanged publicly. Some reports even suggest it was dressed in a mock coat and hat to further humiliate it. Its body was left to rot as a warning to others. Yes, a warning to other wolves. This may sound absurd, but to the medieval mind, wolves represented something primal and ungovernable. They lived on the edge of civilization, slipping between shadow and tree line. They were feared not just for what they did, but for what they symbolized: the wild, the unknown, the failure of divine control. These trials weren't just symbolic, they were deeply emotional. In the age before modern forensic science, people needed justice they could see. They needed ritual. And by staging a courtroom reckoning with the beast, they reasserted human dominance, at least symbolically. But there's another layer to this. In many regions, wolves were believed to be more than animals. They were shapeshifters. In eastern France and parts of Germany, the belief in werewolves was pervasive. People thought that evil men could turn into wolves, and that some wolves could think, reason, and even plot. So, when a wolf attacked, it wasn't just a beast. It might have been a cursed soul, a criminal in fur. That belief found its way into legal codes. In some areas, laws were passed that treated certain animal attacks as capital crimes, deserving of full trials, executions, even exorcisms. The wolf became a kind of stand-in for all the fears people couldn't name: sin, disease, chaos, the devil. And in a world without surveillance, DNA, or reliable communication, rumours become reality. A child's mutilated body in the woods, a missing shepherd, a strange howl in the night. All signs pointed to a beast not just of nature, but of hell. This particular trial in France wouldn't be the last. Over the next 2 centuries, more wolves would be tried, convicted, and executed. Each time, the ritual played out. Witnesses, verdicts, punishment. It wasn't justice, it was theatre. But it served a purpose. In a time when people had little control over the natural world, these trials gave them the illusion of control. And in the face of the unknown, sometimes illusion is enough. It wasn't just wolves that stood accused. In the dusty town of Savigny, France, the year 1386 saw one of the most bizarre legal spectacles in history. The accused, a pig, the crime, the murder of a child. As the story goes, a young boy had wandered into the courtyard of his home when a sow, loose from a nearby pen, attacked him. The child died from the wounds, but the town didn't stop at grieving. They wanted justice. And that meant a trial, not just for the owners, but for the pig itself. The pig was seized, chained, and formally charged with homicide. Local authorities appointed a defense attorney who, by all surviving accounts, took his job seriously. He argued that the pig was unaware of its actions, driven by instinct, not malice. But the prosecution disagreed. They insisted that the pig had knowingly attacked the boy, and therefore it must be punished as a rational agent. A crowd gathered in the town square to witness the trial. The pig was brought before the court, its hooves shackled. A judge in full robes read the charges. Witnesses, including the boy's parents, spoke with sorrow and fury. The defense pleaded for mercy, but it was no use. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. And so, with all the ritual and pageantry of human justice, the pig was led to the gallows and publicly executed. Today, we look back on this with disbelief. But in medieval minds, animals were part of a moral universe. They could be blessed or damned, and if they could commit evil, they could be judged. What's even stranger is how elaborate these proceedings became. The pig was often dressed in clothes, a tunic or trousers, to mimic human criminal punishment. Sometimes monks would be called to absolve the animal's soul. In rare cases, animal trials lasted weeks, with detailed legal arguments and written judgments entered into municipal records. These weren't isolated incidents. Between the 13th and 18th centuries, dozens, possibly hundreds of such trials took place across Europe. Cats, bulls, goats, horses, even insects were tried. Some were hanged, others were burned. Some, oddly enough, were acquitted. To us, this feels like madness. But think about it. These trials reflected a society trying to impose order on chaos. When terrible things happened, especially to children, it was easier to punish a physical body than to confront the randomness of tragedy. And in a deeply religious age, even animals were believed to operate under divine or diabolical influence. A pig that killed a child might be viewed as a tool of Satan, just as a loyal dog might be seen as touched by grace. The case of the Savigny pig may sound like medieval absurdity, but it's a window into a deeper truth. Justice, in any era, is as much about belief as it is about fact. And when belief paints the world in moral terms, even animals become subjects of law. While civil courts held pigs and wolves accountable, the church had its own theatre of justice. And sometimes it wasn't just about justice, it was about spiritual warfare. Welcome to the world of ecclesiastical animal trials, where animals were not hanged, but excommunicated. In 1519, in the French town of Autumn, a plague of field mice descended on the vineyards, destroying crops and livelihoods. But instead of setting traps or fumigating fields, the villagers turned to the local bishop's court. They filed a lawsuit against the mice, and believe it or not, the bishop's court accepted the case. A lawyer was appointed to represent the mice, and he argued vigorously. He claimed that the rodents were part of God's creation and had the right to food and shelter. But the prosecution countered, These mice were not ordinary. Their numbers, timing, and destruction suggested divine punishment or even demonic influence. The court deliberated and eventually issued an excommunication decree. That's right, the mice were formally expelled from the protection of the church. Priests performed public rituals, casting the creatures from God's grace and commanding them to flee. But why excommunicate animals? In the medieval mindset, the natural world was intertwined with the spiritual. If a swarm of beetles devoured grain or lice infested a monastery, it wasn't just a biological event, it was a sign, and signs demanded symbolic actions. Church courts believed that by expelling animals spiritually, they could reclaim sacred order in a world constantly teetering toward chaos. Excommunication ceremonies often included candles, incense, Latin chants, and even processions. In one case, monks in Switzerland excommunicated leeches. In another, a bishop in Lausanne excommunicated caterpillars with the same formula used for heretics. But these rituals weren't always effective. In autumn, the mice came back. And so did the questions. Were these processes genuinely believed to work, or were they performances, rituals meant to calm a frightened public? What we do know is this: ecclesiastical animal trials often took themselves seriously. Clergy wrote full legal opinions. Scholars debated whether animals could possess souls or intentions. Some even wondered if the devil could enter an animal's body, echoing ideas from earlier demonic possession cases. To the medieval mind, nothing was exempt from judgment, not even beasts of the field. And in a world ruled by signs, symbols, and scripture, the act of putting mice or pigs on trial wasn't madness. It was theology made real. By the 15th century, animal trials began to take a darker turn, one that blurred the line between beast and man, fear and folklore. Enter the werewolf trials. Yes, there were times when medieval courts didn't just try animals. They tried people for becoming animals. In 1521, in the town of Poligny in eastern France, a man named Michel Verdun was accused of being a werewolf. Witnesses claimed he had been seen prowling the woods, his body covered in fur, his eyes glowing in the dark. He was arrested and tortured. Under duress, Verdun confessed, not only to transforming into a wolf, but to killing and eating children. He even named accomplices. Two others, Philibert Monteau and Pierre Bourgault, were also arrested. Their confessions followed the same chilling pattern. They had made a pact with the devil. They received an ointment that allowed them to become wolves. They would slip into the forest at night, hunt, feast, and return to human form by morning. These were not isolated stories. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, dozens of people across France, Germany, and the Netherlands were put on trial for lycanthropy. Some were burned at the stake. Others were tortured or exiled. The belief was not just that they had committed crimes, but that they had become beasts, violating both moral law and natural order. The church played a key role in these persecutions. In its eyes, becoming a wolf was not merely folklore, it was heresy, a blasphemous inversion of God's design. To become less than human was to willingly step into the realm of Satan. Witchcraft, animal transformation, and cannibalism all became tangled into a single terrifying narrative. But what's truly fascinating is how these trials overlapped with the ones we've already seen. The pig that ate a child, the mice that devoured crops, the wolf that killed livestock. These weren't just random animal attacks in the medieval imagination. They were signs of spiritual corruption. And increasingly, people believed that behind every beastly act was a human or a devil wearing a beast's skin. Werewolf trials show us something raw and primal. How terrified people were of losing control, of themselves, of nature, and of the boundary between man and animal. In a world of chaos, the werewolf was the ultimate horror story. It wasn't just the wolf you feared, it was the man who chose to become it. Today, the werewolf lives on in myth and media, in novels and Halloween masks. But centuries ago, it lived in courtrooms, and people died for it. By now, one pattern is impossible to ignore. These animal trials weren't just about punishing disobedient beasts. They were mirrors, reflecting society's deepest fears and failures. and sometimes the animal on trial wasn't a threat, it was a scapegoat. In 1519, in the French town of Autumn, a pig was tried and executed for murdering a child. The court found it guilty, and it was publicly hanged. But modern scholars looking into this case have found no records of witnesses who actually saw the pig commit the act. What they did find were signs of social tension, a recent famine, widespread poverty, and growing unrest. In times of instability, assigning guilt to an animal was sometimes a convenient way to diffuse community outrage. If the child had been left unattended, if the village failed to protect the poor, these were hard, systemic truths. But hanging a pig, that provided closure. It turned tragedy into a ritual of justice. These trials also functioned as public theatre, a way for local authorities to reaffirm their power, demonstrate control, and show that justice, however symbolic, had been served. When rats were summoned to court for crop destruction, everyone knew they wouldn't appear. But the act of summoning them said something. It showed that the law extended even to the smallest violators of order. Sometimes the trials took a strange turn into moral allegory. In 1457, 3 pigs were tried in Savigny, France. One was sentenced to death, but 2 piglets were acquitted because the court decided they were too young to understand their actions. That's right, pigs were granted legal innocence based on age. What does this tell us? That these weren't just about crime, they were about morality, intention, and the need to assign meaning to chaos. Much like medieval flagellants or witch hunters, animal trials tried to tame the wild world by creating ritual responses to it. And yet, underneath the theatrics was something very human: grief, confusion, and the urge to make sense of the senseless. In many ways, these trials weren't just about beasts, they were about us. Yes, animals had defense attorneys, and yes, some of them were really good. In fact, one of the most fascinating aspects of these trials wasn't the bizarre fact that pigs or rats were put on the stand, but that they were often given full legal representation. The most famous of these defenders was Bartholomew Chasseneuil, a 16th century French jurist whose most legendary case involved rats. In 1522, in the Diocese of Autumn, the townspeople filed a suit against the rats for eating all the barley. Chasseneuil was appointed to defend them, and he didn't just show up. He made legal history. First, he argued that the rats had a right to be properly summoned. Since they didn't appear in court, Chasseneuil claimed the summons were invalid because the rats had to cross long distances to reach the courthouse, and doing so would put them in danger from cats and other predators. This, he argued, violated their right to a fair trial. When the judge tried to proceed anyway, Chasseneuil demanded a delay. He cited legal precedent, he filed motions, he created such an elaborate web of argument that the trial dragged on for weeks, until it was eventually abandoned. This wasn't satire, this was real law rooted in the belief that justice must be served through proper process, even for animals. And, in a strange way, it showed the intellectual gymnastics of a legal system trying to reconcile reason with superstition. Some defenders argued that animals lacked moral agency. Others said their actions were acts of God or nature, not crimes. These arguments, often made with serious academic and theological rigor, were less about the animals and more about testing the boundaries of law itself. Chasseneuil's rat case became a kind of legal legend, studied by law students for centuries. His defense wasn't about saving the rats, it was about preserving the logic of law in a world desperate for order. In that sense, he wasn't just defending vermin, he was defending reason. The legal language used in these trials is astonishing in its detail. Records survive of pigs being described with terms like culpable beast or willfully violent. Legal scholars depassed animal behavior with the same care as human crimes, discussing motive, circumstances, even possible remorse. And so, these trials became classrooms for a growing legal tradition. They forced societies to define justice, intention, guilt, and perhaps most importantly, innocence. Because if you can argue for a rat, you can argue for anyone. It wasn't just wolves or pigs. Sometimes the enemy was smaller, much smaller. In 16th century France, a group of tiny agricultural pests, weevils, were put on trial for destroying vineyards, and not just in passing. These trials spanned decades. The case took place in the region of Saint-Julien. The town's vineyards were under attack, and the community believed the culprits weren't just a nuisance. They were criminals. The weevils were formally charged in a legal document. A trial was scheduled. A defense attorney was appointed on their behalf. The courtroom drama that followed was unlike anything in history. The church and civil authorities argued that the insects were violating the natural order, ruining not only the crops but the livelihoods of the people. Excommunication was proposed as a punishment, not just banishment from the land, but from the grace of God itself. Imagine that, excommunicating bugs. On the other side, the lawyer for the weevils mounted a surprising defense. He claimed the insects, like humans, were God's creatures with a right to exist. Perhaps their presence was divine punishment for the community's sins. Perhaps humans had failed to honor their pact with nature. The lawyer even argued the town had no right to exclusive ownership of the land, since the weevils had likely been there first. The trial went on. At one point, a compromise was proposed. The town would donate a plot of land where the weevils could live undisturbed. A truce, of sorts. But nothing came of it. The weevils, being insects, didn't recognize court orders. The vines continued to suffer. Eventually, the case was dropped, not because of a lack of belief in justice, but because the law had simply met its limits. These cases, as strange as they sound, reveal something deeper, a medieval world trying to rationalize chaos. When crops failed or livestock vanished, people sought causes and answers, and they turned to the one institution that claimed authority over both heaven and earth, the church. By placing even the smallest beings under legal scrutiny, the church reinforced its dominion, not just over souls, but over nature itself. These trials weren't about weevils. They were about fear, control, and the desperate human need for order in a world ruled by the unpredictable. We may laugh now, but in a society where superstition, science, and faith were all tangled together, a weevil in the courtroom was less absurd than admitting powerlessness. As bizarre as these animal trials may seem, they weren't isolated spectacles. They were deeply entangled with theology. In a world governed by faith, every misfortune needed a cause, and every cause had to align with divine order. So when crops failed, plagues struck, or livestock were attacked, it wasn't just random, it was spiritual. The church held enormous power, both in law and in belief. Priests and monks were often called to testify or even preside over animal trials. Their role wasn't simply to interpret scripture, it was to interpret reality. If a wolf attacked a child, it might be seen not just as a predator, but as an instrument of Satan. Demonic possession wasn't limited to humans. In some cases, animals were believed to be acting under the influence of dark forces. This belief in animal culpability had roots in older folklore and pagan traditions, but the church repurposed it with chilling efficiency. By declaring that animals could sin, they reinforced the idea that the church alone could judge sin. Even the smallest goat or insect was not beyond ecclesiastical reach. Consider the bizarre case in 1457 when a sow was put on trial in Savigny, France for killing a child. Not only was the mother pig executed, but her piglets were tried as accomplices. They were acquitted due to lack of evidence. The legal process mimicked that of a human trial. Depositions, defense, sentencing. The execution was public, brutal, and symbolic. It wasn't just about justice, it was about moral theatre. In many of these cases, the church blurred the lines between law, ritual, and superstition. Animals weren't merely livestock, they were symbols, moral actors, and sometimes scapegoats. Their punishment was meant to cleanse the spiritual stain from the community. But these rituals also reveal a deeper human instinct, the desire to name the source of suffering. It wasn't enough to lose a crop or a child. The people needed to understand why, and in the absence of science, they turned to the sacred. If animals were guilty, then evil had a face. The world made sense again. These strange proceedings also served to reinforce societal hierarchy. The church stood above nature, and by trying animals, it demonstrated its dominion over both the earthly and the divine. A wolf might be wild, but even it could not escape judgment. If you thought pigs and wolves were strange defendants, prepare for an even more surreal twist. Insects were once placed on trial. Yes, flies, caterpillars, and weevils stood accused of crimes against humanity in the eyes of the medieval legal system. Entire swarms were summoned to court, excommunicated, and condemned to leave farmland or face divine punishment. The records are astonishing. In 1519, French authorities in Autun brought a case against a colony of rats for destroying the barley crops. A legal advocate was even appointed to defend them. His defense? The rats could not appear in court because the journey posed mortal danger due to the presence of cats along the route. The judge accepted the argument, highlighting just how seriously these proceedings were taken. This wasn't just a farce. These trials were public rituals, woven into the very fabric of rural life. When locusts descended or beetles devoured vines, people believed it was more than just bad luck. It was a sign of imbalance. So they turned to the church and the courts to restore order. Swarms were summoned to appear before the court and given a deadline to vacate the land. If they failed to comply, a sentence of excommunication was passed, literally banning them from the church's grace. You might wonder, how could people believe such a thing would work? But in an age without pesticides, explanation, or control, the law became a desperate form of magic. It gave suffering people a sense of agency. If even insects could be judged and cast out, then no evil was beyond human reach. Some regions even had standardized prayer templates and formal ecclesiastical procedures for dealing with infestations. The line between church, law, and agricultural science was blurred into a single ritualistic framework. These weren't simply jokes at the expense of backward times. They were deeply meaningful societal expressions of anxiety and control. And while we can laugh at the idea of a beetle getting a subpoena, we shouldn't underestimate what these acts reveal about medieval thought. The world was a moral theatre, every creature a potential actor in a divine script. If a swarm invaded a field, it had a reason, it had a purpose, and if it wouldn't leave, it would be judged. In the strangest turn of all, some animals didn't just stand trial, they became martyrs, executed not only for crimes but also held up as symbols of sin, chaos, and atonement. Their deaths were theatrical. Public hangings, burnings, even crucifixions weren't unheard of for animals declared especially wicked or possessed. But beneath the spectacle lay something darker, a profound unease with nature itself. Take, for example, a 15th century case in Switzerland where a sow was dressed in human clothes before being hanged for attacking a child. The dressing wasn't arbitrary, it was part of a ritual. By giving the animal human traits, its punishment became more meaningful, more symbolic. The line between beast and man blurred, reinforcing that divine justice did not discriminate by species when the crime was moral in nature. In another bizarre case, a rooster was burned at the stake for the supposed crime of laying an egg. The logic? Only the devil could cause a rooster to lay an egg, and such an act was deemed an affront to the natural order, witchcraft in avian form. There was no tolerance for deviation in these tightly ordered societies. Even nature was not allowed to step out of line. These ceremonies were meant to appease more than the court. They were designed to satisfy God. They were moral statements to the village. The world had been set right, the darkness removed, and justice served. But they were also acts of projection. Fears about disease, starvation, war, or divine punishment were offloaded onto a goat, a cat, a wolf, and in its punishment, the community felt absolution. What's truly haunting is how many of these executions mirrored human punishments. Gallows, stocks, even funeral rites were sometimes involved. The animals became scapegoats in the most literal biblical sense, symbols loaded with human guilt, paraded and destroyed for communal catharsis. In many ways, these trials mark the earliest documented rituals of public anxiety management. Today, we vent our frustrations online. Then people watched a pig hang and felt their world come back into balance. So what does this tell us? That animal trials were never really about the animals. They were about humans, about a desperate attempt to understand the inexplicable, to blame the uncontrollable, and to feel for a brief moment that justice ruled the world. As the curtain begins to fall on this surreal courtroom history, we must ask, did it really end? The literal trials of animals may have faded by the 18th century, but the echoes of that strange era still linger. The systems that once judged pigs and wolves now judge people, with similarly symbolic weight. And our tendency to scapegoat remains deeply human. Today, we don't put goats on trial, but we do try people in the court of public opinion, often with just as little evidence. Social media piles on outrage in a flash. Public shame becomes the modern gallows, and complex fears get pinned to a single face. The psychological mechanics aren't so different from those medieval villagers who blamed a crop failure on a rat or a death on a dog. Legal scholars still study the animal trials because they reveal something primal. Our deep desire to assign blame when chaos strikes. When faced with a world that doesn't make sense, plagues, natural disasters, or even societal change, we look for an other to hold responsible. In the Middle Ages, that other could be a wolf, a cockroach, even a termite. Today, it might be a celebrity, a political figure, or someone different from the norm. There's also a lingering fascination with personifying justice. We still place blindfolds on Lady Justice, dress her in flowing robes, and arm her with scales. Ritualistic symbols just as theatrical as hanging a pig in a courtroom. The imagery may have changed, but the performance continues. But perhaps the most haunting lesson is this: when societies lose control, they don't always seek truth, they seek sacrifice. Whether it's a pig in 1457 or a digital pariah today, we're still trying to chase away the darkness by casting blame into the fire. The trials of animals remind us not just of what we feared, but of what we feared becoming: wild, chaotic, untamed. In punishing the beast, we told ourselves we were different, but in those absurd, tragic moments, maybe the real animal on trial was us. So, what do we make of a world that once condemned cows to death, that put insects on trial, that summoned pigs to stand before judges and scribes? It's tempting to laugh, many have. But perhaps the true tragedy isn't the absurdity, it's the reflection, because buried beneath the strange and the grotesque is a mirror. It shows us how little it takes to twist justice into spectacle. It reveals how fear can hijack reason, how ritual can become righteousness, and how we often mistake punishment for resolution. The animal trials weren't just about law, they were about belief, about fear, about control. They were society's attempt to tame the chaos of nature, of fate, of death. But the more we study them, the more we realize they weren't really about animals at all. They were about us. And maybe, just maybe, if we remember that, we'll think twice the next time we look for something, or someone, to blame. Thank you for walking with us through this forgotten chapter of legal history. If you enjoyed this journey into the uncanny world of medieval justice, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves the strange side of history. Let us know in the comments. What would you put on trial today, or what do you think should never be? So, what do we make of this surreal chapter in human history? The wolf trials, a time when animals were bound by man's laws, when pigs stood before judges, when wolves were hunted, tried, and executed, not as beasts, but as criminals. It may sound absurd to us now, fictional even, but the records are real. These weren't just folk tales whispered by candlelight. They were part of legal proceedings, official documents, signed and sealed, and the deeper we dug, the more questions we uncovered. What did these bizarre rituals say about the people of that time, about the church's power, about how fear, superstition, and desperation could turn even a forest creature into a symbol of sin? And more unsettling still, have we really changed that much? Think about it. We no longer drag animals into courts, but we do label species as threats. We wage war against predators we've pushed out of their homes. We build myths around animals that have never had a voice in their own stories. This episode might feel like a medieval oddity, but it forces us to confront something timeless: how humans assign blame when nature doesn't follow our rules. Before you go, take a moment to reflect on this strange piece of forgotten history and help us bring more of it to light. If you found this episode haunting, fascinating, or even just plain bizarre, don't forget to give it a like. That single click helps this channel reach others who crave the eerie, the historical, and the untold. Subscribe for more real-life mysteries, forgotten rituals, and hidden truths buried beneath centuries of dust. From courtroom bestiaries to lost languages of the dead, we go where others don't. Drop a comment below. What did you think of the wolf trials? Do you think fear and folklore still influence how we treat animals today? Would justice ever look the same if nature had its own courtroom? We read every single theory, every idea, every question, and your voice shapes what we explore next. And if you want to go deeper, check the description for our sources, rare manuscripts, and books we used to build this episode. There's far more to this tale than could ever fit into 1 hour. History isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's scratched into the margins of forgotten trials and howled into the night by creatures no one bothered to understand. Thank you for watching.